All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get going here in just a few minutes. We still got a few people that haven't joined us just yet, so hang tight. We'll get going here in a bit. If you got any questions in the meantime, please go ahead and shoot them my way. I'll be happy to answer them. Anything fitness related. I always try to save time at the beginning and end, and even kind of in different sections throughout the webinar to answer questions for you guys. So hang tight. We'll get going here in about 2 minutes. All right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's wellness webinar. So today's topic is creating your own fitness program. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation. If not, please let me know. But my name is Charles Burroughs, and I'm the Fitness Services Coordinator over at University Recreation. I'm excited to be back here again. Always love talking fitness with you guys. I'm starting to recognize a few names after doing these a few times now, so welcome back. But if this is your first time, I'm glad you joined us today. I always love talking about really anything fitness, but one of my biggest missions and goals for myself and my career, and then also for personal training over at University Recreation, is to try to empower people and give people the resources and tools that they need to be successful in whatever their fitness goals is. So that's my goal for this presentation is I hope that you take some of the key concepts and tools that trainers use to create fitness programs and use these to create your own. Or if nothing else, use these concepts and ideas to find the right fitness program that's going to be appropriate for you where you're at. But just real quick, a little bit about myself. So I'm the Fitness Services Coordinator over at UREC. I specialize in running the personal training program over there, so that is my main focus. I've been here for about 2.5 years now, but I've been working in fitness for about 8 years now in some sort of personal training capacity, whether it's been at a commercial gym, working in corporate wellness, or even here in academia. I've always had the opportunity to work one-on-one with people, and that's something that I personally really enjoy, is getting the chance to sit down with someone and focus on setting goals and figuring out what program is appropriate for you, depending on your goals and a few other factors. So this is something, like I said, that I'm really passionate about and look forward to talking about. Like with any webinar or presentation I've done, please feel free to stop me and ask questions. I'm going to do my best to make sure I'm keeping a close eye on the chat and the polls and other places where you can ask questions. So feel free at any point to stop me and ask something. It might mean that I'm going to get to it here in just a bit. So if I do, I'm going to hold off. But for the most part, I'm more than happy to stop and answer any questions that you guys have. All right, so let's go ahead and dive right in and talk about creating your own fitness program. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so let's get started with a question, right? And it's, where do I even start with all this? I know that with fitness and with the fitness industries, there's so many places to get started. There are so many programs available. There are so many influencers and fitness professionals online that it can be a little bit overwhelming. I've heard it in the past called paralysis by analysis, and it's we have a hard time getting started, not because we can't find anything, but we can find too much information. And a lot of time that information can be conflicting and make it really harder to do something than it should be. So I guess the best place to start is making sure that we find a program that addresses 3 different things. The first thing is that a program should address your goals. That should be pretty obvious, but I think it's a really important point to drive home, and is that if you have a specific goal that you're trying to achieve, and if you've attended any of my presentations in the past, you know that's something that I really drive home, is it's important that we have a very specific, a SMART goal in mind when we're trying to achieve something with fitness. Going in with something very generic or kind of broad is not a recipe for success. I'm not going to dive into that deep today, but it is important that we have something specific that we want to achieve. So as a result, the program that we're doing should also be specific in what it's trying to accomplish. If we're wanting to run a marathon, then we want a program that's going to focus a lot on running. It shouldn't be the only thing it focuses on, but it does need to focus on running. If we find a program that's very heavily focused on strength training, that might not be the best for what we're trying to accomplish. So it is important that we have a program based on the goals that we have. And of course, as I said, specific goals are needed for specific programming. So the more specific of a goal that we have in mind, the more important that it is to find a program that's relevant to what we want to achieve. But not only this, is we really want to make sure that our program that we have addresses the 3 main areas of fitness. I'm going to talk about that here in a bit, but a lot of times we find a program for something very specific we want to achieve, but we end up neglecting some other really important aspects of fitness that are going to actually help us get the results that we want more efficiently and more safely. So sometimes programs can be extremely one-sided and neglect the other important parts of fitness, which I'll talk about here in a bit. And then lastly, we want to make sure that this program is going to be appropriate for our fitness level. That it is appropriate for where we're at currently. Sometimes we might find a program that is relevant to our goals, it's well-rounded, but it's just not really appropriate for where we're at right now. I think my last webinar I talked about 10 years ago, I did that P90X program, and it checked all the boxes for what I wanted to achieve, but the problem for me was that it was not appropriate for my current fitness level. And I kept getting hurt in the program as a result, and I didn't know why. Part of it was just I wasn't ready for that kind of intense training, and that's okay. All right, so the 3 aspects of fitness, I like to call it the fitness triangle. Some of you, if you're familiar with fitness, you may have heard this as well. There's a lot of different terms for it, but basically there's 3 main areas of fitness, and a good program is going to have these 3 aspects in it. The first one is going to be strength training, or also known as resistance training or muscle conditioning. Basically, it's an exercise modality that specifically targets our muscles. It helps us deal with resistance. Because we deal with gravity every single day, we have to deal with resistance. And so resistance training allows our body to become more efficient at that, whether it's simply carrying our bodies, or maybe it's picking something up, carrying it, loading a shelf, something like that. These normal activities of daily living, resistance training has a big impact on them. And I think a lot of times people tend to neglect resistance training if they have a goal in mind that's more specific to weight loss or burning calories, or maybe just something that's very endurance related. A lot of times resistance training gets pushed to the side, but it's actually a really important component to any goal that we have, and it's going to help us be more efficient in getting there. So resistance training is a very important part to any program, regardless of what your goal is. One of the other points of the triangle is endurance training, or stamina training, or quite simply cardiovascular exercise. This is exercise that aims to improving our cardiovascular and respiratory health. So basically our heart and our lungs. So any kind of exercise that elevates our heart rate for an extended period of time, that's going to be endurance training or cardiovascular training. In fact, a lot of times resistance training, if done at the right pace where it keeps our heart rate up, can also be endurance training. So even though these are separate aspects of fitness, a lot of times they overlap. A lot of good programs are going to overlap. They don't have to, but that is very common. So even though I'm talking about these things separately, a lot of times they end up getting treated hand in hand together. And then the third aspect is going to be flexibility or mobility training. This one is kind of like the little forgotten brother in fitness, I think, especially amongst younger individuals who care mostly about weight loss or some sort of very specific fitness goal. A lot of times flexibility and mobility gets pushed to the side, and it shouldn't. It is extremely important in doing a lot of things. It helps to improve our range of motion so that our bodies move correctly. It also helps with recovery, whether it's from an injury or just from exercise. It also helps increase blood flow and prevent injuries. So flexibility and mobility training, whether it's yoga or simply stretching, warming up is also included in this category. But these are all really important parts of fitness that are often neglected or overlooked. And actually, I have a little anecdote on flexibility training. Recently, a trainer came to me, and he's a great trainer. He's in good shape. He's probably like 20, 21 years old, works really well with his clients. But he came to me and he mentioned that whenever he does a squat, he gets pain in his lower back. And I thought it was really strange because he's been doing this, pretty much since like middle school. He's got good form with his exercises. So I was a little confused of why this is the case. So we decided to do an assessment. I had him do some squats. And I very quickly realized that the problem was that his hips were too tight. He spent a lot of time doing cardio, a lot of time doing strength training. And even though he does flexibility and mobility training with his clients, he wasn't doing it with himself. And even at age 20, if you're neglecting this part of fitness, it can have a big impact on your body. And actually, after about 5 minutes of doing some stretching and rolling, that back pain went away whenever he squat. So it was a very simple fix, but it was a part of fitness that he was neglecting and overlooking. So all that to say is that each one of these components are really important, no matter what your goal is. If you neglect one of them, you can very likely develop some imbalances or even experience some injuries. So all three of these are extremely important. And we're going to dive in a little bit more into each of them as we go. All right, so let's talk about resistance training first. So as I mentioned, resistance training is training that focuses primarily on strengthening and conditioning our muscles. Resistance training is not just about strength training. So even though we call it strength training, it's not just about building strength. It's about proving the connection between our brain and our muscles. It's about improving our coordination, which can help prevent injury, gives us more balance, more body control. There are a lot of great benefits. Resistance training also improves our metabolism. I'm not here today to go into all the benefits of it, so I'll stop myself, but resistance training is really important. So let's talk about some base recommendations. There are tons and tons of ways that you can go about creating a resistance training component to any program. But I think if you start with the basic recommendations and go from there, you'll be successful. And you'll find that while it seems like there are a lot of different options, we can really break it down and make it a much simpler task. So first off, let's talk about frequency. And this recommendation is actually straight from the CDC and Department of Health. And is a recommendation that we target our body with muscle strengthening activities at least twice a week. And I say twice a week. This is the assumption that we're doing a little bit lower volume. I'm going to talk more about volume here in a bit. But that recommendation basically says is that if you were doing a full body workout where you do like one exercise for each body part, you should do that at least twice a week. And that's going to make sure that we are at least maintaining our coordination and our strength, if not improving it. 2 workouts a week is enough to improve strength, to improve our coordination, to get all those benefits from resistance training. So that is our kind of baseline, basic recommendation to ensure that we get some sort of benefit out of it. Now, there are tons of ways that we can still get that same amount of volume in a workout schedule. So you can see there, I've got a few different examples. You could quite simply just do a full body workout twice a week. You could split it up and do one upper body where you're doing more volume. and then switching to lower body and then doing just more volume of lower body. You can split it up in what's called push-pull legs. We'll get into what those terms mean here in a bit. Or you can do a full body split where you're doing each body part separately every day of the week. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this. This is done a bit more by bodybuilders or people who've got a lot of time to commit to training. But this does just go to show you that there are a lot of different ways that we can accomplish this, as long as we're accomplishing it some way or another, whether it's full body, split upper body, a lot of options. But just know that as long as we're following that recommendation of hitting our entire body twice a week, or getting that volume every week where we're hitting our whole body, then we're going in the right direction. So let's talk a little bit about volume. And I've got a formula there to calculate total volume. I'm not saying that you need this, but for those of you who really like numbers and like to be very specific in any kind of program that you follow, this would be a good way to track that. And total volume is simply calculated by doing the number of exercises times the number of sets that you're doing, so how many times you're doing that exercise, and then how many repetitions of that exercise. So if I'm doing 15 push-ups, that's 15 reps. If I'm doing it just once, that's 1 set. And that's how you calculate volume. Just multiply through those numbers. But a good recommendation to start with is 1 to 2 exercises per body part, and then about 5 to 8 exercises per the whole workout. That is a very good recommendation that if you take that, you can absolutely see some good results just by doing it. And that's regardless of which one of those splits that you choose, whether it's full body, upper body, lower body, etc. Just notice that if you think about it, if you start to get more separated on body parts, that you're going to end up doing a lot more volume per body part. Because if you only did 1 exercise per body part, but that was the only thing you did that day, then you wouldn't be doing very much. So in order to get to that 5 to 8 exercises per workout, if you're doing just chest or just back, you end up doing a lot higher volume for each body part. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, it is a lot of volume. And if you're new to exercise, that's not necessarily needed in order to get results. And also, if you're doing it that way, if you're doing that body split where you're doing each body part, it also means there's going to be a lot more isolation exercises where you're targeting just that muscle. And that's not necessarily something I recommend starting out. But we're going to get to that more here in a bit. So talking about sets, so how many times we do each exercise, anywhere from the 2 to 4 range, 2 being a good number of sets to start out, 3 being a nice intermediate number, with 3 to 4 being a good more intermediate to advanced. You could do more sets than that, but again, the 2 to 4 range is a good suggestion for just about anyone. And then in terms of how many repetitions per exercise, anywhere from 8 to 15 is a good general range for most exercises. If we start getting much higher than 15, if we're starting doing 20, 25, 30, 40, we're starting to get away from the resistance training aspect and starting to move more into cardiovascular training. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if our goal is to do resistance training, it's to get those benefits that come from doing strength training, to lifting weights or doing some sort of resistance, then we want to keep those repetitions a little bit lower in that 8 to 15 range. And I don't want you to quibble over, well, should I do 8 or should I do 15? If we can at least stay within that range, we're going to get these benefits regardless of which one we choose. And then looking at just total volume, so using that formula I talked about, if you were to do 1 exercise per body part, so 5 exercises in a workout, 2 sets, 15 repetitions, that's going to come out to about 150 total reps on the volume scale, where if you were to do the high end of each of those numbers, you get up to the 480, 500 range. This can be a good way to track your progress in the gym, is to just look at total volume and see that number slowly go up. That's one way that we can progress, is by manipulating one of those different numbers in that formula to improve. And I'm going to talk about here in just a second of which one I suggest doing first. But in general, if we see our total volume going up, that's a very good indication that we're seeing improvement in our resistance training. It's not always just about lifting more weight. there are a lot of different factors that we can see improve. And if your goal is not necessarily to get really strong, then I would definitely recommend adjusting one of these other factors instead of just the amount of weight. And then last thing, when I say entire body, I'm talking about the legs, hips, the abdomen. I don't say core there because if you've heard me talk before, core is a little bit more complicated than just the muscles right here in your stomach area. But we do need to hit those muscles. We also need to hit our chest and our arms. So full body is going to include all of those different areas targeted throughout the week. So any questions about that before I head on to this next section about strength training? So one person said, do I recommend resistance bands? Absolutely. They can be a great option. Dumbbells, resistance bands, even using your own body weight, which I'll talk about here more in a bit. Any kind of resistance is going to provide great resistance training. Resistance bands are unique in that they provide what's called variable resistance. And so the more that you push or move a resistance band, the harder it gets. So it's unique to traditional weights, and that a weight doesn't change. 5 pounds is 5 pounds is 5 pounds, but a band is going to change the more that you stretch it. So it provides a very unique stimulation to your muscles that you don't get from other forms of resistance because it changes the more you pull on it. So it is a unique way to mix up your program if you've already got something going on. Great question. So talking a little bit more about strength training, I do have a few other recommendations, things to consider.
Hey, Charles, I think we had a question in the chat as well.
Oh, got one in the chat? Okay, let me check that real quick before I move on. Thoughts on high-intensity interval training with weights. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about high-intensity interval training when we get to the endurance part. I do think it can be good. What I will say is that high-intensity interval training with weights is going to be a little bit riskier in terms of potential injury, just because you're pushing yourself really hard and then also moving weight, which can result in injury. But I'm going to talk about that more here in just a bit. So it's a great question, Jason. I'll get to that more here soon. Yes, so some other recommendations, general recommendations with strength training. One is I really recommend starting with full body movements or compound movements. So we're using multiple joints at once. I like to call these big movements. So it's not an isolated exercise. It's something we're having to use multiple muscles. So for example, a bicep curl is a very isolated movement, right? We're basically using just this muscle as we're curling the weight up. But if we were to do, say, a back row, that's going to target the muscles in our back. It's going to use muscles that we need for posture as we're sitting up straight. And then it's also going to use our biceps as that angle in our elbow is decreasing. So looking for ways that we can do full body or compound movements is going to be really beneficial because they more accurately represent movements that we actually do in real life. So there's more carryover. So for example, how often do you really do a movement just like this by itself? I mean, maybe to pick that coffee mug up off the desk, something like that. But when we think about some of the benefits that we get from resistance training, coordination, body control, it's going to be more beneficial if we do movements, or at least some movements, that mimic things that we actually do in real life. So squatting down to pick something up, a deadlift where we're having to get something heavy and move it. Those are movements that are using multiple muscle groups, and it teaches our brain to not just use these muscles, but use them together in concert, and that is really important. So I really recommend, if you're just starting out, to use movements that use multiple muscles. And I'm going to actually give some good examples of some starting exercises here soon that you can use. There we go. Body weight exercises are also extremely effective. That goes back to this idea of finding movements that can be used in regular everyday life. And so body weight exercises, since we have to deal with our body weight every single day anyways, body weight exercises are a great way to start out with exercise. Absolutely. And we can find that there's about a body weight exercise to target just about every muscle in our body, which is awesome. So in terms of just suggested progression, Like I talked about a little bit, you can adjust, if you see that total volume number going up, that's a good sign. And what I typically recommend and what we typically use in personal training is when we start to progress with a client in a certain exercise, the first thing that we're going to improve is going to be the number of reps. That is a very simple thing that we can increase without changing a whole lot. So maybe before you were doing 10 push-ups, and now we're going to progress to doing 12 push-ups or something like that. Maybe you're doing like a chest press. And then once we've hit a good number, like let's say we started at 8 and then got up to that 15 number, then we can increase the weight. So maybe if we're doing a chest press, I was doing 10 pounds, and now I'm doing 15. And maybe now that I'm doing 15, I'm going back down to that 8 reps and then working my way back up to 15. It's a very steady way of progressing without trying to progress too fast, too quickly. But after we've done that, we can also progress in the number of sets that we do. So maybe you're used to doing 2 sets of every exercise in your workout, and you're starting to realize at the end of the workout, you're really not tired anymore, that you're starting to feel much more energy. And so as a result, we progress to doing 3 sets of everything. I put sets as the third option because increasing by entire sets is a lot of increase in volume, especially if you're doing it for the entire workout. So I usually recommend increasing the number of sets once you feel like you've gotten a good amount of experience under your belt. So maybe you've been doing it for a month or 2 or 3, you feel like you've really hit your groove, that might be a good time to start increasing the number of sets that you do of each exercise. And then after that, we can look at adding more exercises into our workout. So maybe rather than just doing 5 or 6, now we're doing 7 or 8. And that is another way, again, of increasing that total volume. And then my last suggestion for increasing or progressing in your fitness is going to be increasing the complexity of the exercise. So finding an exercise that is quite simply, it's harder to do. Whether it's because you're using free weights or maybe you're doing it standing instead of seated. But finding ways to make an exercise more difficult outside of just reps and weight is a good way to continue to progress in your own fitness. One other recommendation I have is that if you do have a specific goal, then it is a good idea to increase volume for that specific area. So for example, let's say that your goal is to specifically get stronger legs. So in addition to having a resistance training program that targets the whole body, let's add a little extra volume specific to the legs. So going back to those examples there, maybe what you're going to do is you have 2 full body workouts a week, and then you add a third workout that's going to be just legs. That is completely fine to do that if your goal is to get a stronger lower body. We're not going to get imbalanced by doing that as long as we keep the timetable reasonable. You know, don't do it for 20 years straight maybe. But if your goal is to get stronger legs, there's nothing wrong with increasing volume in that specific area that you're wanting to work on. And that's why, regardless if it's resistance related or if it's endurance training, something like that, which we'll talk about here more in a bit. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly talk about a few basic movements that just about every workout program is going to have, and that ensures that you're hitting the whole body. These are some great beginner exercises. Pretty much all these are body weight except for that third one on this page, which I would say is the least important of the 3, but is still an important movement that we need and that carries over to regular life. And the first one is going to be a push movement. So a push movement in the upper body is really going to be any time that the resistance is us pushing away from the body. That might be a push-up like you see in the picture, which is a great beginner exercise to focus on developing upper body strength. But it can also be a chest press. So if you're sitting at a machine or laying on a bench and pushing the weight away, as long as the hard part of the exercise is the pushing motion, then that's going to target our chest, our shoulders, and then our triceps as well. It is a good compound movement that is using multiple muscles at once. And like I said, is a great way to develop our body strength. Now on the opposite side of that is the pulling motion. So often called rows or simply pulls, but any kind of pulling motion is when we are moving our arms perpendicular to our body, but the hard part is pulling it towards us. So that can be us pulling our bodies towards like a bar like you see in the picture. That's called a back row or a body weight back row. But also it can just be us pulling weight towards us. So regardless of whether our body is moving or our arms are moving, as long as the hard part of the motion is the pulling part, then that's going to really develop our muscles in our back and our biceps. And that's going to be the main focus for that exercise. And then another beneficial exercise we can do in the upper body is going to be any kind of overhead pressing movement. Typically, it's just called a shoulder press, but all we're really doing is pressing a weight up overhead, really engaging our shoulders and also a lot of our core and our back to maintain our posture while we're doing that movement. This one, usually you do need some sort of weight. It doesn't have to be dumbbells. It could be bands. It could be a chair. It could be your dog. It doesn't really matter what it is, as long as there's some sort of resistance that is challenging your shoulders as you're pressing up overhead. Any questions about upper body exercises? I'm going to talk a little bit about lower body as well. Let me check real quick. All right, I see a good question about routine. I'm going to get to that more towards the end. It's a good question though. One person said, between sets, should someone plow forward to the next set even if they're quite winded and tired, or should they rest in between? You know, what are the pros and cons of that? This is a good time to talk about how cardio plays involved with weights. So what I will say is that if you try to push through a workout when you're winded, you're going to start using that cardiovascular system more. And that's not a bad thing, right? Obviously, we need to do some endurance training, but just understand that because we're starting to use our cardiovascular system more, that's going to use more energy and can take away a little bit from the strength training aspect. If we're getting fatigued because our heart and our lungs isn't keeping up, then that's not such a good measure of our strength as it is our cardiovascular system and strength. So if we're going to push through like that, just know that, think of it as being more like a jack of all trades rather than a master of one thing in particular. So it's not a bad thing. If your goal is cardio related, or perhaps you're on a time crunch and you need to keep your workout shorter, maybe you have a hard time committing a set period during the week just to cardio, then there's nothing wrong with doing a faster paced workout. What I will say is that if you start to get so fatigued that you can tell it's affecting your ability to do the exercise, that's when it's time to stop and slow down. If at any point you notice that your form is getting worse because you're fatigued, which does happen, if you get too fatigued to do the exercise correctly, it's time to stop and slow down. You can get the cardio benefits while resistance training without having to compromise our form. Just know that when you're doing both at the same time, it's a lot harder to perfect one thing in particular. You're just kind of going to get good at both, and that's not a bad thing. That's a lot of how group exercise classes work, which is awesome. A lot of times I do that style of training with clients or even myself because I like doing both at the same time. Just know that it requires a little bit more energy and effort when you're trying to do weights and cardio at the same time. Great question. One person asked how to gradually build up strength to be able to do push-ups. The best way to build up strength for push-ups is to do some sort of push exercise. Ideally, that's going to be a push exercise that still uses your weight. So you see in this picture, he's doing a push-up on a bench, but you could do something at an even higher incline. It could be on your desk. It could even be on a wall. But what we want to do is we want to try to replicate that movement as much as possible. So unfortunately, you might read online somewhere, oh, you need to build stronger shoulders, you need to build a stronger chest. But the truth is that if we want to get better at a specific movement, like push-ups, we need to do a movement as close to it as possible and repeat it often. So in this case, finding a version of push-ups that is easier is going to be the best way to get better at it. So starting at like a higher incline, and then as you get better, slowly working your way more towards the ground. And then eventually you can get to a point where you're horizontal on the ground doing regular push-ups. But what I recommend is starting more at an incline or from the knees, and then slowly working your way down. That's the best way to get better at push-ups. Absolutely. Great question. So let's talk a little bit about lower body. Well, real quick, let me make sure I didn't miss anything else. All right, I think we're good. So let's talk about just a few quick lower body and core exercises we can do. So when we're talking about lower body movements, the easiest way to split them up, because just like upper body, there's tons of different lower body movements. But the easiest way to think about it is one is going to be hip flexion and extension. So if you're creating like an L shape with the person in the picture, and the bottom part of the L is her thighs, and the upper is her spine. Any type of hip flexion extension is when we see that angle increase and decrease. The easiest exercise to think about with this is a squat. It's the most common exercise, and it's for a good reason. It hits just about all the muscles in our legs and is a really good exercise that carries over to real life. Squats are a fantastic exercise to do hip flexion extension. So in this exercise, we're hitting the glutes, we're hitting the quads, we're hitting our hamstrings to a small extent, and even our calves. So it is a really good exercise. And any workout program, we want to have some sort of hip extension and flexion. So seeing the angle of the hips increase and decrease. Similarly, is going to be what's called unilateral movement. And it's still basically hip extension and flexion, but it's one leg at a time. And this is really important because it actually has a good bit of carryover to how our body moves naturally anyway, right? When we walk, we don't walk two legs together, they alternate. And so finding exercises that replicates that in our workouts is important. And so lunges is a great body weight example of the unilateral movement where we got one leg going this way, one leg going the other. And it is a really useful neuromuscular development that we can do, is to work on movements that separate our legs like that in that fashion. And then another great exercise that we can do, and I put it here in lower body, but our core is composed of the muscles in our abdomen, but also some in our back, and then our glutes as well actually plays a big role in our core. So pretty much everything from the rear end up to the neck and shoulder area, all those muscles in our trunk are going to be part of our core. And so every good workout program is going to have exercises that develop either core movement or core stability. Most bodyweight exercises, we're going to have to use our core in order to do the exercise correctly, but there's nothing wrong with implementing exercises that are specific to the core. So I have a plank on here. I love planks. There's really no movement involved, but it's still targeting our core as we're resisting gravity to keep our body in that nice straight line there. So a great core exercise is going to be planks. You can also do other exercises like crunches and tons of options, rest and twist, but a plank is a great starting beginner exercise that's going to help develop our core strength. Any questions about these exercises before I move on? There was a question one person asked is, are there any tips of knowing where to start out? These exercises are a great place to start it out. I'm going to show you in a bit how to take these exercises and create a workout plan with them. But these are some great beginner exercises that are going to hit pretty much all of our major muscle groups. But once you get comfortable enough in seeing the movement, so for example, I just talked about hip flexion and extension. We can find other exercises that do that as well. So for example, a glute bridge also does that. We see in a glute bridge, we're extending our hips to create a straight line with our body. So that is also going to recreate that hip flexion and extension, especially the hip extension as we're extending our body into a straight line. As you start to get comfortable with what these movements are with our body, we can find different ways of doing them. So talking back about that push-up, there are a lot of different exercises we see that mimic this movement. You will see some people sitting on a machine that just presses forward. That's still a push movement. You'll see people laying on a bench and using dumbbells or a barbell or even bands to press. That is still a different version of this movement. So a lot of upper body exercises that you'll see are going to be different variations of what we're seeing here. And so I really recommend to start with these basic movements, and then you can always progress and increase your exercise repertoire after nailing these down. Absolutely. Let me check the chat real quick, make sure I'm not missing anything else, and then we'll move on. Okay.
I think we got
Awesome.
a question in the Q&A.
Q&A? Oh, don't miss one. Let's see. What category does the stair climber fall under? That is a great question. Yeah, that is a great question. So I would argue it depends on your current level of conditioning. Generally, it is cardio. But if you don't have a lot of leg strength, it can also be strength training for you. So I would say it depends on how long you can last on the machine and how much you feel your legs burning while doing it. I would say if you're new to exercise and you're just starting out in the stair climber, a good portion of it is also going to be strength related, because it takes a lot of effort and strength to lift your body up one leg at a time. However, as your conditioning improves, you're going to notice that it's less strength training and more cardiovascular training. But I would say it's a good combination of both, especially starting out, with probably a slight edge given to the cardio aspect, as opposed to just resistance training. So kind of a mixture of both, but I would say it leans more towards cardio for most people, especially as you do it more and more. I would say the stair climber is not necessarily a beginner-friendly version of cardio because it is very intense. I don't know if you've ever tried to do 15 or 20 minutes consecutively on a stair climber, but it's pretty brutal. And it does require developing up a certain level of muscle conditioning in our legs to do that. Great question. All right, I think I got them all, but like I said, I'll keep checking just in case. All right, so let's talk a little bit about endurance training. So as I said before, this is the type of training that focuses more on stamina and our cardiovascular endurance, so our heart and our lungs. That stair climber was a great example of how things can carry over, how we can be doing both things at once. But when I talk about endurance training, we're definitely, the main focus is going to be getting our heart rate up for an extended period of time. So once again, I'm going to look at the recommendations from the CDC and from the Department of Health to kind of create a nice baseline here of what we should be trying to target every week. So in terms of volume, it's recommended to get about 2.5 hours or 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity every week. When I say moderate intensity, I'm talking about like a 4 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. So you can think of this as like a brisk walk. 2.5 hours sounds like a lot, but actually for people who are semi-active throughout the day, a lot of these are just done naturally. For example, students, they easily get this just by walking to class on a regular basis, especially if you're running a little late. You're going to get that moderate intensity aerobic activity just from doing that. It's a little bit harder for those of us who maybe are working more sedentary jobs and have to be a bit more intentional. But for example, let's say you're setting up tables for an event. More than likely, that's going to be some moderate intensity aerobic activity. There's a reason it's challenging, and that's because there's a little bit of a cardio component to it. But with that being said, I believe the last numbers I saw, I think it was like 2018, is 70% of adults don't get this recommended number anymore. And a big reason of that is because we are becoming more sedentary, right? We have cars, we have a lot of convenience. We can go to the grocery store and just have them deliver it to our car. I can only imagine how COVID has impacted this even more. But a lot of people aren't getting this recommended number of moderate intensity aerobic activity. But another recommendation going along with that is you can get 2.5 hours of moderate intensity activity, or we can do more vigorous intensity aerobic activity. So with this is more like jogging or running, a lot more examples than that, of course, because it's any activity to get our heart rate up. But if it's more vigorous, which usually vigorous intensity is much more what we think of when we think of cardio. If we're going to go get on a bike and push ourselves for 20 or 30 minutes, that's going to be vigorous intensity. Even if we're not at like a 9 or 10 where we feel like we're really pushing ourselves, if we're elevating our heart rate up at more like a 5 or 6 on a scale of 10, that's going to be more of the vigorous intensity side of things. So when I am talking with clients or people about starting something, vigorous intensity is more what we think of with cardio. So if you're at a good kind of beginner to intermediate level, you can do vigorous intensity exercise unless there's some specific health conditions going on, which we can talk about. But 75 minutes of that, so that comes out, I mean, if you were to do, 3 workouts or 3 days of 25 minutes, right there, you got it. So it's not quite as much volume as it seems. The moderate intensity is much more likely to happen in our everyday lives unless we're just sitting at a desk. And you can also get a combination of the two. So, you could say instead of 150 minutes of moderate intensity, you could just do 75 minutes of that and then half of 75, so 30 to 40 minutes of vigorous intensity. You can mix and match and still get those benefits that come from regular cardiovascular exercise. But like I said, there are lots of different forms of cardio. One thing that's nice about endurance training as opposed to strength training is it's not like there's different exercises for our heart. Anything that we're doing to get our heart rate up is going to be beneficial for our heart rate. So any activity that we can find, and I doubt I could list every possible one on here, but running, hiking, biking, brisk walking, swimming, boxing, I mean, just about anything you can think of. We already mentioned before, weight training can be cardio as well if we're going at a decent pace to keep our heart rate up. So if you find a different activity out there, maybe it's playing tennis or basketball, those are great ways to still get that endurance aspect without just having to sit on a treadmill and do that for 30 minutes straight, because that's not for everyone, and that's okay. Find an activity that works for you and that's going to get your heart rate up for those recommended volume times. One other thing I'll say about endurance training here is that in terms of frequency, we still want to spread it out. I wouldn't recommend just doing like 2.5 hours in one day and just be like, all right, I'm done for the week. That's it. I'm good to go. Unfortunately, that's not really how cardio works. We want to continually put that stress of cardiovascular exercise on our body at regular intervals. So 2 times a week is kind of like the bare minimum to maintain. And that's assuming that we're leaving a day or 2 at least in between to spread it out. But really 3 times a week is a good number to start progressing with our cardiovascular exercise. And again, that can be moderate intensity or vigorous intensity, either one. I do want to talk a little bit about 2 different kinds of cardio. Someone had actually mentioned in the chat the high intensity interval training or steady state cardio. I just want to give you my quick thoughts and also what the research says on these 2. So high intensity interval training, for those of you who don't know, is basically a form of cardio where we are alternating between a very high bout of intensity. So let's say you're doing 30 seconds of like an all-out sprint or riding a bike as fast as you can. And then you immediately follow that with 30 seconds, a minute and a half, whatever it is, of really low intensity to try to build up our energy back and repeat that process. So high intensity intervals are going to be very up and down, while steady state cardio is you pick a pace, it's going to be pretty moderate so that you can maintain it for the entire time, and then you just maintain throughout. So that's the difference between the 2. There's been a lot of good research on the difference between interval training and steady state. The first thing we want to factor on, like which one we want to do, is going to be dependent on our goals. If we are an athlete, if we need something where we need high bouts of intensity in our performance, then you absolutely need to do a high intensity interval training. However, if that's not a part of our goal, then we could simply do steady state cardio and get some similar benefits. But some of the unique aspects of interval training is, one, we can get similar results from steady state cardio in less time. I saw some interesting research that showed that I believe it was about 20 minutes of high intensity cardio can get you similar results from about 45 minutes of steady state cardio. And a big reason for that is you're putting a much higher stress on your cardiovascular system in a short amount of time. And when we put stress on our cardiovascular system, that's how we get results, right? We're purposely getting our heart rate up to get results. So interval training is a good way to get a pretty quick adaptation to cardio in a little bit shorter amount of or time put into that workout. So like I said, 20 minutes versus 40 minutes. So just looking at that alone, you might say, well, why would anyone ever do steady state cardio if they can get benefits from interval training in less time? And there are a few reasons. The main reason being is that there is a higher risk when doing interval training. Because you're pushing yourself harder, you're fatiguing faster, you're also moving your joints quicker, you're more than likely to experience some sort of injury, especially if you're new to exercise. So what I would recommend is that if you are new to exercise and you want to do interval training, try to pick some sort of exercises that feels natural and that you feel comfortable with. I wouldn't recommend doing an exercise you've never done before and then trying to do high intensity intervals with it. You're much more likely to hurt yourself because your body is not familiar with that movement. And then another reason you might avoid interval training is because it's not as pleasant, not as an important reason, but it is an important reason. If you absolutely dread a form of working out, then you shouldn't do it. Some people, they enjoy a steady state cardio session where they can just hop on a bike, shut their mind off, and do that for 30 minutes. And if that's more appealing to you, or if you want to learn to get better at that, maybe you want to run a marathon, steady state cardio would probably be a better option for you. What I would say is that, contrary to what a lot of people say, one is not necessarily better than the other. It really just depends on your goals. If you want to be very efficient with your time and you don't mind a little bit of intensity, then you know what? HIIT training can be for you. One person had asked, do I recommend HIIT training with weights? And I would say that yes, if you feel comfortable in being able to control those weights throughout the workout. I think it's really important that you monitor yourself closely when you're doing any kind of HIIT workout with weights. As soon as you start to feel like your form's failing or you're starting to feel different, maybe you're not moving the weights quite the same, then I would say slow down. Interval training it's really important that you're monitoring yourself closely and that you're paying attention to what you're doing. Because if you're not careful, you can very easily hurt yourself, especially when weights become involved. I would recommend if you're new to HIIT training not to do it with weights. Instead, get used to pushing yourself to that level of intensity first, and then you can start using weights as you improve and develop. So any questions about anything regarding to cardio training? So that could be something related to steady state versus HIIT. It could be related to those suggested recommendations from the CDC. Anything about cardio? Usually for beginners, I recommend separating weight training from cardio if you are able to do so, if you have the time to do so, because that gives you an opportunity to really focus on each one separately and get better at it. When we combine them, it's a little bit harder to do that because we're trying to do two different things at once. We're trying to improve our cardio and get stronger, and that's really challenging to do when we're new to exercise, especially if we want to make sure our form is good and that we're doing it correctly. So I always recommend separating the two at first, and then as we develop and as we improve, then we can start to combine the two a little bit more. All right, make sure I see all the questions. All right, I don't think I see any new ones, so I'm going to go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about flexibility training. So I know we got about 5 minutes left, so I'll try to wrap it up. But let's talk a little bit about flexibility and mobility training. Like I said, this is kind of like the little brother to the fitness triangle. It's often forgotten, especially amongst people who are new to exercise, and then also the younger crowd, like the students age. They often completely ignore this. And the reason because, you know, these might not have the same benefits that they're looking for. You know, they want to get stronger or faster or look a certain way. And flexibility training doesn't have a direct correlation to that, so it often gets put to the side. But it is actually very crucial to exercising safely and effectively and getting the results that you want. So some baseline recommendations for this. Like I said, this is the forgotten little brother, and that even includes the CDC. They don't actually give good recommendations on this, which is a shame because it is super important. But what I recommend for flexibility mobility training is 4 to 7 days a week. That sounds like a lot, but in terms of amount of time spent stretching, it's really not that much. We're talking about maybe 5 to 10 minutes at most. But one thing that's interesting about stretching as opposed to running or to lifting weights is that our body is very stubborn to adapt to flexibility training. It takes regular effort. If you're only doing it twice a week, it's going to take a very long time to see some benefit from flexibility and mobility training. So what I really recommend is that you can find a routine of just some full body stretches and do those every single day, even when you're not exercising. It can be first thing in the morning or right before you go to bed. But really, to get the benefits of flexibility and mobility training, you need to do it often, do it frequently. Someone asked a question about length of workouts. I'm going to get to that in just a second. Great question, though. So for volume, I suggest 1 to 2 stretches per body part that's being worked. So if you're doing just an upper body workout, then doing stretches for those body parts is going to be probably the most efficient use of your time, rather than doing a whole body stretch routine with that workout. Real quick, I'm going to talk about the difference between dynamic stretching and static stretching. I think it is really important to understand the difference of the two, and then I can answer any other questions you guys have. But dynamic stretching is going to be a form of stretching that is active movement. When we think of warming up for exercise, we want to do dynamic stretching. And really what that is it's putting our joints through a range of motion that warms them up so that they're ready to move during actual exercise. So for example, if I'm going to do an upper body workout, I want to do some arm circles, something like this, where I'm purposely moving my shoulder joint in a big range of motion. That's going to help lubricate the joint. And it's also going to make sure that the muscles are ready to fire for when we actually start doing pushes or presses or whatever it is. But dynamic stretching can be anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes before a workout. And that's just finding active movements that we can do with little to no resistance to warm up the joints. Static stretching is going to be what we mostly think of when we think of stretching. And that's going to be those more controlled, slow holding stretches where we're actually trying to lengthen the muscle, especially if we're tight. So static stretching is going to be much more beneficial at the end of a workout, typically not recommended at the beginning. Static stretches, though, can be done by themselves. So like I said, if you're trying to stretch every single day, which I recommend, static stretches are a great way to do that. You don't really have to be super, super warm in order to do a static stretch because it's not real high resistance. Really, the resistance is just your own muscles. So those are the differences between the two. So real quickly, just how can we put this all together? And then I'll gladly answer some questions. So what I did here is I took everything that we talked about and just put it together in a sample program. So I decided for my goal in this example is I just want a general strength training, and I want to focus a little bit on my core strength. I want to be stronger in my core. So what I did is I took the exercises that we talked about, and I said I'm going to do 3 sets of each in that 8 to 15 range, whatever I can do. And I'm going to do those on Mondays and Fridays. And then since I wanted to do a little bit extra something for my core, I decided I'm going to do a class at UREC, shout out. I'm going to do hardcore on Wednesdays at 5:15. And that's just going to be a little extra something I'm going to do to target those core muscles so that I know that I'm doing a little bit of extra work for the core. So I'm doing those planks in each of those workouts, which is going to help. I'm going to be using my core to do these exercises. And then I'm going to have a core day to specifically target it even more, just to make sure. Could I probably still get results without doing that? Sure. But since that's my goal, I'm going to really drive that point home and add an extra day to do it. Now, since I wanted to separate cardio from weights myself, I'm not going to be doing those exercises fast paced. So I decided to add some cardio on the side on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If I wanted to, I could speed up those Monday and Friday workouts and probably get some good cardio there. But since I decided I can afford to do this with my schedule, I'm going to do a 30-minute bike ride on Tuesdays and Thursdays to make sure I'm getting those recommended amounts of cardio. And then just for good measure, I added that Saturday, just a brisk walk over at the Riverwalk to add in those few extra minutes I may have missed between the bike ride in that exercise class. Because that hardcore class, it may be fast-paced, I'm not sure, depends who's teaching. If it's a little bit faster paced, I'm gonna be working my core and my cardio. But I went ahead and added that walk on Saturdays just for good measure to get it all together. And then lastly, I added just some warm-ups in here. So 5-minute warm-ups just before. I'm gonna do some generic movements that are gonna warm up those joints before I work them. I decided not to provide any specific stretches because really if you go online and look for a full body stretch routine, just about anything you find is gonna be good. So if you need a warm-up, you're not sure where to go, you can just Google quick full body dynamic warm-up and you're gonna find some good stuff. I haven't found really any bad warm-ups. As long as it's not super, super fast, it's gonna be a good warm-up to warm up your joints. And then I added a cool down as well, just 5 minutes of some quick stretches. In this case, it's gonna be one stretch for each body part. So I might do a chest stretch, a shoulder stretch, legs, and a back stretch. But just putting it all together, but I wanna make sure I got some time for questions. So fire away if you got something good. Jason asks, what length of time for workouts do you recommend to keep your body guessing? I would say if it's about keeping your body guessing, the way to do that is going to be more by changing up the exercises than any specific length of time. If you are following those recommendations, and I assume we're kind of talking about like a resistance training workout or a combination of the two, then really I would focus more on volume than the amount of time. So like, let's say you chose 6 exercises and you're going to do those at a fairly quick pace. More than likely, that's probably going to take about 30 minutes. If you were at a 5-minute warm-up, 5-minute cool down, you're about 40 minutes. So really 30 to 40 minutes, if you're going at a fast pace, is more than enough time for any fitness level. If you need it to be harder, then you quicken the pace even more. But anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour is perfectly a decent amount of time to working out. If you're doing more than an hour, then I would assume that you're taking a lot of rest. So the amount of time spent actually working is still going to be probably in that 30-minute range, 20, 30, 40-minute range. You're just adding more rest in between. But really when it comes to like keeping our body guessing, that's going to have more to do with changing the exercises themselves, whether it's the weight, the actual exercise, how many sets. That's going to be a better way to keep our body from finding any kind of plateau rather than just a length of time. Great question though. Someone said, what is the best exercise to focus on for when you're pregnant? I would say it's still going to be full body exercises. You want to focus on core strength, but obviously doing movements that are appropriate for that. That topic on what exercises are appropriate or not could be in a whole nother webinar. But I will say is look up some full body exercises that are appropriate for someone who's pregnant, or tell you what, you can even shoot me an email and I can give you a bit more information on that. But I would still recommend full body with even more emphasis on the back and the glutes because being pregnant does cause a lot of forward pressure on the body. So we want to make sure to keep a strong glutes and a strong back to help counteract that. Someone said, what should we eat after a workout? And I would say a good combination of protein and carbs is going to help recover. So, I mean, that's pretty broad, but I would say any kind of good protein source. So it could be a protein shake if that's something you like. Me, I prefer to just have a regular meal. So I might have like some sort of like chicken stir fry or something like that after. That's going to have a good source of carbs and a good source of protein. Protein is going to help rebuild our muscles, especially after resistance training. And then the carbs are going to help refuel the energy that we use during that workout. So any kind of post-workout meal that has protein and carbs is going to be good. Absolutely. So anonymous user said, I've been on my journey to get healthy since August of 2019. I have lost 70 pounds. Congratulations. That's awesome. I'm currently on a plateau, but I am still staying on course. Do you have suggestions best for dealing with loose skin and overcoming a plateau? So with loose skin, what I will say with that, because it is a very common question, is that there's not much that we can do for loose skin other than give it time. Our skin elasticity takes a long time to shrink. And there is only so much that it will shrink. So there is a certain point where it's just not going to get any tighter, the skin. But I will say is that if you give it time, a lot of times that skin is going to start to shrink on its own. The one main thing that we can do to affect that is to gain more muscle. And you'll actually find most people will find that when they gain muscle, they're not going to immediately get big and bulky like a lot of people seem to think. But really what's going to happen is you're going to develop more tone in your muscles. So you'll start to see the muscle a little bit more without them being like big and bulky. But building muscle is a good way to help to stretch the skin a little bit or to help prevent some of the loose skin that's there. And as far as overcoming a plateau, a lot of it's going to depend on what you're doing right now, but what I recommend is change it up. Change the intensity, change the exercises that you're doing. We could really dive into some more specifics with that, but I'd recommend shooting me an email that you see on the screen if you want to talk a little bit more detail about programming. It might be that you benefit from a session or two with a trainer, or even just sitting down with someone to change up what you're doing. But if you've hit a plateau, then more than likely it's because we need to change up the intensity and the way that you're exercising. But congrats again on that. That's awesome. I love hearing stories like that. I'm going to check the chat real quick. I'm on the Q&A right now. I want to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Someone said, I have high blood pressure and blood pressure. There we go. And then on medication. Is cardio exercise good for me? Yes, 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 100% yes. What I would say is that high blood pressure medicine, or excuse me, blood pressure medicine is there to get our blood pressure back to a more even level. What I would recommend is that before going to exercise, I would check your blood pressure real quick and see where it's at. If it's elevated, then what we want to do is we want to pick a steady state cardio that is not really, really intense. So think of like a 4 to 6 range on a scale of difficulty out of 10. Pick a 4 to 6 range and do that for anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour, whatever you feel comfortable with. But cardio is very, very important for blood pressure and heart health. So if you do have high blood pressure, I really recommend starting doing cardio ASAP, as soon as you can. The main consideration with that is just choosing a little bit lower intensity, not jumping right into that HIIT training, but start at a little bit more lower levels where we're still building a sweat, we're still elevating our heart rate, but not doing it to such a high intensity where we feel like we're going to pass out. But yes, absolutely. Cardio exercise is very, very good for us, especially if we have any blood pressure issues. Great question. Anything else? Want to make sure I'm not missing anyone. I think someone may have mentioned that they love to have a copy of the presentation. So I know that Ashley Bowman and the wellness team that I believe they either post it online or send it out. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm going to make sure they have a copy of this as well as a recording of this presentation to make sure y'all have this as a resource, because I know some of those recommendations were really specific. So I want to make sure you guys can get a copy of it and see it so that you have something to look forward to. In case you do have any questions, I'll stick around for a bit. But we do have some programs coming up with fitness services. I really encourage you to check out. We have a summer program coming up called Summer Heat. It's an 8-week fitness program. The goal of the program is going to be a bit more like educational and learning focused. So it's definitely still working out. But my goal for it is to teach our participants how to exercise so that they can take the things that they learn in the program and apply it afterwards. So if that's something you're interested in, registration is going to begin next month later. So you can always go to the website and just search for Summer Heat and you'll probably find it. But that program is coming. We do also offer personal training services. That's one-on-one training, partner training, in addition to like the programs that we have. We also do assessments, consultations. So even if you don't necessarily want to commit to like a full workout routine with a trainer, even just getting a consultation is a good place to get started. And then also, of course, always definitely recommend trying out a group exercise class. We got one for every possible goal you could have. So definitely recommend trying that out. One person asked, I love foods high in fiber and how they help the body, but recently with, place fear for. So that's a good question. I'm not going to really touch into that dietary question too much. What I'd actually recommend is reaching out to either Ashley Bowman or Sheena Gregg, our on-site dietitian. That's a little bit of a tricky question, and I don't want to get into it too much myself. That's a little bit kind of outside my scope of practice. But I would recommend reaching out to them and getting in touch with one of the dietitians that are on staff. They can kind of help give you some more tips on that. So it's a good question. I just don't really feel comfortable answering it with my own expertise and experience.